Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm your co-host, Kevin Getz, sitting here. Wait, Andy, how's it going?
Hello. Yeah, so here we are again.
Here we go. Andy, what are you drinking?
I'll let some root beer.
I'm drinking a Diet Coke, but nonetheless, cheers.
So what are we talking about this time around then, Kev?
You know, something has occurred to me, and how long have you been doing this?
Living history I've been doing now for 10 years. Ham and Jam, which is we're into the 6th year now, I think.
Look, I've been doing it almost 25 years now. I started reenacting, had shifted over to the living history. And something I just thought about is you and I both, we're just always talking about the Glider Pilot Regiment and all things British Airborne. So how'd you get started?
Well, for me, I've mentioned on other episodes that my grandfather was a big influence. And because he took part in Operation Market Garden as part of 30 Corps, one of his favourite movies was A Bridge Too Far. So I grew up with that movie. My grandfather took me to see it when I was very young, and it made an impression on me. I didn't join the Airborne when I joined the Army. I went to the Army Corps and I was a tank driver because my grandfather actually said, if you're gonna go in the Army, go on something you can sit in and drive rather than walking around. But that wasn't always the case. So the Battle of Arnhem and the Airborne has always been there from a very early age. It's always been present. It's always been present. And a lot of people, that movie is an intro to the Second World War.
It's so funny you mentioned that because we're separated by a full ocean. Yeah. I was the same way. For me, it was A Bridge Too Far. It was usually on television here in the States, usually on like Saturdays. Although I do remember in the evening watching it with my grandfathers on one of our big television affiliates, ABC, used to have the ABC Sunday Night Movie or whatever. And they showed that. And I was a kid. I didn't know anything about it, but there was the music. Even my mother, who wasn't really one for war movies, she absolutely loved the music from A Bridge Too Far. Yeah. And I remember watching, of course, everybody knows about all the famous movie stars, but it always had really cool dialogue and really neat lines. And honestly, as a kid, I had no idea it failed, but the movie was so cool. And that's what really hooked me. And then for me, it was my dad. My dad was a history teacher here in the States. And he's the one that really got me hooked on history and a love and a passion for history. And then I had watched the films so many times. I actually had a friend of mine goes, "Hey, have you ever done reenacting before?" And I didn't know what he was talking about. Here in the States, obviously, the big thing is Civil War. I had read a lot about Civil War reenactments and that sort of thing, but I had no idea there were different time periods of it. And then naturally, because I had watched the movie so many times, I thought, you know what? I think I'm going to go as a Brit Para. So you started off as just a regular British paratrooper. Yeah, just generic, whatever suited the event or scenario that was. But yeah, just general para.
So then what drew you to the GPR, the Glider Pilot Regiment?
Boy, that's a great question. We're like all of us. You start wanting to better what you're doing. Yeah. So you start getting the books and you start reading the accounts, the personal accounts. And that's when I started hearing about the Glider Pilot Regiment. And I started reading books about them and started reading about their training and how more intensive it was. And I thought, that's really cool. It's almost, I'm sure they'll never say it, but it's almost like pre-special forces kind of thing, especially when the glider pilots were, okay, you're going to learn how to shoot a pack howitzer, or you're going to learn how to shoot a Bren. That's really fascinating. These guys train to fly, and then they train to fight on the ground. I think that's the impression that I want to go for. And then obviously, as you read more and more accounts, that's what I wanted to do. What about you? I know you and I have been chatting over a year now, and I know how much great work they're doing at the Army Flying Museum and the Glider Pilot Regiment.
Well, you start off with the Bridge Too Far, the movie, and then you move up to actually read the Cornelius Ryan book.
Oh, not to interrupt, really cool connection. I attended Ohio University, and I actually graduated from the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism, which is the repository for the Cornelius Ryan archives.
Well, there you go. See?
Spent many a time in the Cornelius Ryan room at the Scripps School.
Yeah. So that was my in to the airborne side of things. But Yeah, once I got into reenacting living history, I started off in the 100th Airborne Unit. And at that time, the reenactment scene was very heavy American Airborne, predominantly 101st. And I did that for about 5 years. And I wanted to do something different because everyone seemed to be doing American Airborne. So when I decided that I was going to go back to my roots as I'm ex-British Army anyways, and I grew up in the 80s, that's what we have in the UK, Army Cadets, which is like the Army's youth group. It's like the Boy Scouts, but affiliated with the Army. And so I was having either 37 webbing, we trained on number 4 Liev kilts and brain gun. The World War II stuff was, it was so prevalent and it was so cheap. I mean, if I'd known then what I know now, I wouldn't have spent a fortune rebuying it all as an adult.
I can remember there was a catalog called the Sportsman's Guide, and they sold P-37 gear. It was like a dime a dozen.
Yeah. So Hammer Jan was a one-man band. I've said this before. I had a girlfriend at the time who was going to do home fun. And I started off doing Box and Bucks because although I had grown up and had a love for Market Garden and Arnhem, again, looking around at the British Airborne groups in the UK, most of them, from what I could see, focused on 1st Airborne and the Arnhem era. So apart from The Longest Day and Pegasus Bridge scene with Richard Todd, I didn't know that much about the airborne stuff. Yeah, Merville Battery.
Sure. You brought up an interesting point because I've always been curious about this. Why do you think Arnhem in the living history reenacting scene, and then in general, why does Arnhem capture the imagination of the British public?
Because the British loved the underdog. They loved the glorious last stand. They loved the Sandalwana, the Rorke's Drift, the Maywand. They loved underdogs and they loved famous last stands and heroic last stands. And the bravery shown on, even though it was a failure, the bravery that was displayed in that battle has, and I think also as well, because especially if you're a student of history, it conjures up so many what ifs.
Sure.
For the general public, I think it's the heroic effort that went into it. In Britain, we're not so much about the winning. We like to win, don't get me wrong. We do like to win, but we have this saying about, certainly with sports, it's the taking part that matters. If you don't win, it's not the end of the world. So for the general public, I think it's the heroism that was on display in the finest traditions of the British Army and everything. But for historians or living history, reenactors, it's the what ifs. Well, why it's spoken about so much now and theorized about so much and we do it, don't we? We in our conversations, if this had happened 10 minutes earlier or John Frost and 2nd Battalion Group had actually got to the bridge half an hour earlier, he would have stopped Grabner's recce going to Nijmegen and stopping the 82nd from taking Nijmegen Bridge. It's fun to do the what ifs.
Sure. Well, when you and I were going to Lower Farms, which is roughly just short of a 3-hour drive, we spent a lot of time just what ifing.
Yeah, we were. Yeah. This is going to keep people going for years to come. And this has been said before as well. Every time you watch Bridge Too Far or read a new book about, I know Al Murray said this and other people have said it, you're willing them to actually do it this time, but it doesn't actually happen. It is a bit like Frank Sinatra in Von Ryan's Express. You're willing to get on that train at the end, but he never does. Or Richard Harris and the Wild Geese. You're willing to get on that Dakota, but no, every time you watch it, Richard Burton still shoots him at the end. It is that what if. But going back to it, started doing the 6th Airborne reenactment stuff, Ox and Bucks, prevalent. And then, because I was doing a lot of reading about Pegasus Bridge and Ox and Bucks and 249 Royal Engineers. Obviously, you've got the glider pilots in there.
Okay.
Going back to a Bridge Too Far, when you watch from so many times, you start looking into the background a little bit more.
Yeah.
What's going on in the background? And there's a scene at the Hart sign where the guy runs out and, you've got glider pilot guys there with their wings.
And what's really interesting too about that scene, and I know you and I have both picked up because we talked about that, is not only do you have glider pilot guys, you have a number one and you have
you've got a second pilot. Yeah.
You got a second pilot. So really a nice little tip of the hat with the level of detail.
Yeah, we all know that they got things wrong, but they also got an awful lot right.
Right.
So one of the first books I actually bought when I was doing the 6th Airborne, I got Neil Barber's books about Pegasus Bridge. The Day the Devil Dropped In, it's about Merville and the Chateau Saint-Côme. Great books. But one of the first books I got was actually One Night in June. And the other one was Silent Invader. And obviously, that's GPR, that's glider pilots. So one of the first books or couple of books I read involved glider pilots. And as time has gone on, I've just been more drawn to, even though in the army, I was an armored corps soldier, I was armored cavalry, I drove tanks, I drove reconnaissance vehicles, nothing to do with flight, no helicopters or Army Air Corps, anything like that. For some reason, I'm drawn, probably because I've never really, up until now in my adult life, I've never known as much, or until I started reading up and doing my research, I'd known about the glider pilot, but I didn't really know about what they did. I had read Louis Hagen's book. In fact, I read Louis Hagen's book when I was in Kosovo in 1990, an old beaten up paperback, and I shoved that into my Bergen, and I read it when I was out there. I'm drawn to things that I don't know a lot about. And at that time, I didn't know a lot about the glider pilot. And now I've picked it up and run with it. Same as you.
You get those early books. Well, like you said, certainly Silent Invaders, the Glider Gang.
Yeah.
Very early. And then I've got my base knowledge about the cold hard facts, formations, operations, rock, Chatterton.
Mm-hmm.
And then for me too, then reading back the experience of the guys, because I always thought it was really interesting. So I started reading the personal accounts and getting those things, because I always, I'm all horse all the time. And
when did this happen?
I know, right? It was something that I found really interesting. It was fascinating. Was reading their accounts of what they thought about there, what their training was like when they were learning to fly, and then how and then with each account, it all seemed very similar in that they loved it. They thought it was easy to handle.
And the reasons for why they did it, lots of different, and I've heard say this before when we were talking to the public, that the reasons were varied, and it wasn't just because they were bored and they wanted to learn to fly, or they wanted only RAF and couldn't fly powered aircraft. A lot of it was boredom, but there was extra pay, they had a promotion, the snazzy Maroon Beret.
Yeah.
And I know at least one person who told their family it was because, using British terminology, the birds, the women, might be attracted to the smart red beret and the wings. So lots of varied reasons. But it is very interesting in the personal accounts how these pilots actually came to be in the GPR. Nothing is Impossible is another awesome book. If people haven't read that, I highly recommend Nothing is Impossible.
Victor Miller.
And again, we're going back to Bridge Too Far and the attention to detail. And I know you always talk about this.
Oh my gosh. I remember it's really interesting. I watched it one with a friend of mine. For some reason, it came on black and white. We couldn't get the color. And so it was really fascinating because it made me concentrate more. And that was the moment when it was after I had read Victor's book, and I see the horses take off, and it says S. Sergeant V. Miller and S. Sergeant Tom Hollingsworth. And I was like, the light bulb went off. I'm like, oh my gosh, what an attention to detail, what a way to put love into that film that you actually recognize a tip of the hat. Of two individuals who were actually there.
And one didn't come back.
And one did not come back. So let me ask you this, Andy. Obviously, you and I are extremely passionate about this. What kind of response do you typically get when you're at a public event, or say you're at the Army Flying Museum, when you're talking about the GPR and people get to see the uniform and the kit?
Good question. I'm sure you get this in the States. A lot of people don't realize that we actually use gliders. And the ones that do realize that we had gliders didn't realize that we had things like the Hamilcar and the Hotspur, because they might have seen a Bridge Too Far, and obviously in a Bridge Too Far, all you see is,
or they would have seen the model from
or the longest day. So that's often a surprise to people, that we actually use more than one glider, or the whole thing of, I didn't realize we had gliders. And the other thing you get a lot of is, not so much maybe at the Army Flying Museum, but at events, is people see the Maroon Beret and they'll say, oh, look, the Paracet. So you get a lot of that, and then you have to explain that the Maroon Beret wasn't just the parachute regiment. It was one of the signs that you're an airborne soldier, Pegasus patch.
Because obviously within that being an airborne soldier, you aren't necessarily a parachute. You could be an engineer,
air landing. You could be some that were part of the echelon.
You could be medical corps. You could be Army Service Corps that you're dropping.
So sometimes you have to explain that, and that is also true today. Not everyone who wears a Maroon Beret is going to be parachute regiment. So that's one of the first things you have to get across to people. The other thing that people will say is, and you get this, I know you get this over here in the States, is that the gliders were designed, they crashed.
Yeah.
They crashed. They were dead strapped. Yeah, they were. And I said at the weekend to somebody, I said, well, if that was true, if they were designed to crash, how the heck did you train the pilots? Because every time you landed a glider, it would crash, and then you'd have to get a new glider you would have trained. Yeah.
I always, we get the same thing. I always got to say, let me kind of change your thought process. They were actually designed to land.
Yeah.
And then, of course, for me, I always put it in the perspective of some of our listeners know what I do for a living is, I'm in law enforcement, and there is such thing as a vehicle crash.
Yes.
And that's how I kind of make the comparison so people understand. So yeah, if we're flying a Horsa and it hits a wall or it hits a tree or the wing breaks off and then it hits the ground again, that is a crash.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Horsa was designed, we were to land in one piece so we could get everybody out.
Exactly. And the problem is you go through the reference books or the pictures that are in the papers whenever there's an anniversary event or whatever. And the ones that you always see are the crash gliders.
Yeah.
You always see the 3 gliders at Pegasus. They're obviously in bits. And that's what people take away from that. They don't see all the aerial photographs and landing zone or the landing zones at Arnhem, where the vast majority of those gliders are in one piece, or if you see them in 2 pieces, because they've taken the tail off to get the G's out at the back. And that's the problem. People remember the photographs of that glider that's gone through a wall or a hedge.
You joined me here in the States, and we attended a public event at Lauer Historical Farms, which is located in Lima, Ohio. And give me what your feeling of being able to be here and to talk about the glider pilot, which you're so passionate about here in the States.
It was great to be in the States, first off, but to be doing something that I absolutely love in the UK with the blank canvas and meeting the American public. If the British public weren't aware that the British had gliders in World War II, it was highly likely that the Americans didn't know that they had gliders. So it was great. It was a blank canvas. It was great the way that we worked together. We had some really good interactions, actually. I was pleasantly surprised.
Absolutely. And I agree from this standpoint, because speaking from my personal experience, and I've mentioned this on social media before, because typically when I go to these events, I'm an American, the Yank being a Brit. And usually I get what I call the 3 big myths of stopping to drink tea all the time, or Monty was too slow. And then, the USA, we bailed you out of the war. And I don't know about you, but certainly with our interaction with the public over a 3-day period, I never really got a sense that we caught any of that.
No, certainly not. We didn't. It was nice, actually, a couple of occasions that we had. Well, I certainly had one that was one member of the public that was he served in the American Air Force and was based in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
It was great. He was very receptive to what we were saying. Again, he was aware that the use of gliders, but he didn't realize how big they were. When I said that they were the size of a small bomber, he was very surprised. I think and I think also, you had some people that you spoke to that were surprised that they could bring in Jeeps. I mean, even the Waco, could bring in a Jeep,
sure,
or a gun, or a trailer.
And with the event with our group and where our setup was, we had a Jeep, And it was nice to have that aid there so that to provide context. So we could point to it and say, hey, you see that vehicle, that Jeep and the trailer that's with it could go into the back of a horse.
Yeah. Oh, and of course, the other nice surprise was the member of the US Army. And one of the guys, he knew about the Tetrarch light tank. That was really surprised.
And that really surprised me as well. And I've been doing this here in the States for a long time. And I can tell you, Andy, I've never had anybody come up to me and actually say the word Tetrarch tank.
Yeah, and that caught me
completely off guard.
And then he actually went on to actually add, so when did they switch to the M22 Locust? So that was really good.
Oh, I mentioned for you, that was
For
like,
me, well, next I was, hey, talking. So there were some nice surprises with the public. The War of Independence wasn't mentioned too many times. I was feeling too to begin a ribbon about that. Where's my red coat? But no, it was really good, and I can't wait to come back next year.
There really is something about the feeling of accomplishing with us because we do what we do. I know you. Again, you do such great work over at the Army Flying Museum. I've been afforded the opportunity to do couple of PowerPoint presentations on the glider pilot formation and operations of the glider pilot regiment. There is something about walking away from an event like that going, I feel like we did really good work. Oh, and I don't know about you, Andy, but my thing has always been, if I could get one person that if I mention a book or if they seem interested, and then maybe they go back home, they pop on the internet, they do some research, maybe some book listings come up. Suddenly they go, well, maybe I need to read, maybe I'll get that or check that out at the library. And then they read it. And then that fuels an interest.
Absolutely. And yeah, there is a great sense of satisfaction when you genuinely know the person you're talking to was interested and you've told them something they weren't aware of. So here, I've got a question for you then. Before we wrap this up, 2 go-to books about the glider pilot regiment, any era of the war.
Boy, that's a really interesting question. That's a loaded question as I'm sitting here looking at my shelf. I know you're going to mention Chalky Peters, so I've
got to do that.
Yeah. So for me, for a personal account of, and it's a personal account again, I think sometimes there's great books of glider pilots, specifically at Arnhem, or the nice thing about Nothing is Impossible by Victor Miller, he was involved in 3 separate operations, Operation Husky, Market Garden, Varsity. That's such a really good book from a personal account, but a personal account of an individual who was involved in multiple operations.
Yeah.
And you know what? And I specifically for 9 operations or D-Day, you got to go with Stephen Wright and Kevin Shannon, One Night in June. It is just a really good book. The nice thing about One Night in June is, don't get me wrong, I could fully appreciate what those guys did at Pegasus Bridge. Absolutely. I'm not taking anything away from them. But there was so much more. Those 2 guys, Shannon and Wright, those guys, they did such a great job of kind of relaying the other things that were happening during D-Day. So certainly, those are my 2 go-to. How about you? What's your go-to?
The updated version of One Night in June, Operation Tonga, it was recently re-released where they've added a little bit more information and made some clarifications. I would recommend getting the updated version as well because, as I said, there's new stuff. There's new stuff coming out all the time, and Kevin and Stephen have added this to their edition, so I'd recommend that. Yeah, as I say, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Mike Peters. It's unfair to say what 2 because I've got so many. I know some of you.
Yeah.
I would go with. It's a tough call between Glider Pilots in Sicily and Glider Pilots at Arnhem because they are such good books. They really are good books. If you want early glider operations, then obviously you've got to go with Sicily. Arnhem is fascinating. I can't choose between the 2 of those.
It's really tough.
And I think I'm going to go, again, talking about personal, let's have some also rans then. You've got, obviously, Arnhem Lift. You've got D-Day Arnhem and the Rhine by Robert Ashby, which another triple operation pilots. I'm going to have to go. I'm going to go with Nothing is Impossible, same as you. It's such a good read.
It really is. I got to go with you, too, with Mike Peters. For me, I loved his Sicily book. Fantastic. But to me, in my opinion, the Arnhem operation just really, that's the operation that really cemented the reputation of the Glider Pilot Regiment. That really, the whole total soldier concept really came to fruition. That
Well, you saw glimpses of it in Sicily.
you did. But I think Arnhem really cemented that reputation of who those guys were. And yeah, I can't disagree with you there on Chucky Peters and glider pilots at Arnhem.
Okay, well, I think we've spoken long enough.
Yeah, I looked over and
We could be.
we're getting the nod.
Yeah,
They're closing time, so
So I think we're going to have to call time, gentlemen, please, on this one.
yep. Sounds good.
And you will hear us on the next one.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Cheers.